Well, good morning. It's Tuesday, April 7th. And as Pastor Daniel mentioned yesterday in the video that was posted, he and I decided that it would be good to do a brief video every day this week, not just on Tuesday and Thursdays, because we find ourselves this week in the midst of what is known in the Christian calendar as Holy Week or Passion Week. And it's a week that looks at the final events of Jesus' earthly life, right? We're going to be celebrating Good Friday and then on Easter Sunday. But there's a lot of things that happen throughout this week that are very significant. In each of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they include a considerable amount of information that took place on those final days. So today is referred to as Holy Tuesday. And looking through the Gospels, we notice that it seems to be a rather full day. Here's just some of the events that are included. Jesus' divinity is challenged. There are attempts to discredit his power. This is the day when Jesus comments on the widow's donation. It's the day that Jesus speaks the 8 woes against the Pharisees. And on the evening of that Tuesday, Jesus delivers what is known as the Olivet Discourse. So there's a lot of things happening on this particular day. So I mentioned that Jesus' divinity was challenged. We heard yesterday that Jesus went into the temple and he cleansed the temple. The temple had been meant for worship and prayer, but it had been turned into a flea market of sorts, which causes Jesus to become very angry, and he drives out all the buyers and the sellers and overturns the tables, and he cleanses the temple of such a practice. Now, the Pharisees are very disturbed by this. They've been disturbed by Jesus for a long time. The Pharisees are the ones who are strictly adhering to the teaching of the prophets and oral traditions of the Jewish people. And so they're really blind to who Jesus is. They just don't see him for he being the Son of God or becoming the Messiah. And so they question Jesus and question his right to do such a thing. How could you even come into the temple and do such a thing? Because in their mind, Jesus hadn't received authority from the religious leaders, so they wanted answers. They attempt to force Jesus to state that he had divine power from God so that they could charge him then with blasphemy, even able to arrest him. But Jesus, knowing their motives, he agrees to answer their questions, but first, if they answer whether John the Baptist's work was human or divine. So if they answered John the Baptist's work was divine, then they would affirm that Jesus was divine. But if they affirm that it was simply human, then those who followed John at that time would riot, and they wouldn't want that. It was the Sanhedrin's responsibility to know the difference between true and false prophets, yet they shamefully admitted they didn't know. So Jesus didn't answer their question. Not only did they challenge Jesus' divinity, they tried to discredit his power. Ultimately, Israel's religious leaders had one goal: to get rid of Jesus of Nazareth. And so the conspiracy theories mounted, and if it meant cooperating with a lifelong enemy, any means would be justified. And so the Pharisees, who opposed Rome and its intrusion on the Jewish way of life, and the Herodians, supporters of Herod the Great, well, the two of them, common enemies, they joined forces together. And they joined forces to try to discredit Jesus. Even the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were religious liberals who denied a resurrection, who denied angels, who denied the spiritual. They attempt to discredit Jesus. In Matthew chapter 22, we read of 3 attempts that they try to discredit Jesus. And each time, they want him to fall into the trap. But Jesus knows their motive. And he warns the crowds and disciples about the hypocrisy and unbelief of the nation's religious leaders. Each time, Jesus responded their attempts with words coming back to them. It only confounded them and it infuriated them more. What we can be sure of is that during this whole time, God was orchestrating this week's events. He was going to let it unfold in his time, in his way. There's one more thing I'd like us to reflect on. I mentioned earlier that it was on this day that Jesus gave what is known as the Olivet Discourse. And you can find that in Matthew chapter 24 and chapter 25. You see, Jesus was leaving the temple with his disciples, and they asked him 2 critical questions. They asked him first, when will this happen? Referring to the destruction of the temple that Jesus had just spoken of. And the second question is, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Jesus not only answers their questions, but he presents practical lessons for those who are not only living at that time, but answers that are relevant to all believers in any age, which means for us as well. You know, it's interesting to read about doomsday prophecies and how some people are interpreting the coronavirus epidemic as a sign of the end of the times. You won't be hard-pressed to find some of those little news articles or things to read on if you just simply Google coronavirus end times. They point towards some of the prophecies in the Bible, of course, in the book of Revelation. There's one person that was quoted as saying recently that this plague of coronavirus shaking the world now mercilessly is a mystery hidden in the Bible prophecy of the beginning of birth pain in Matthew chapter 24. But these are not new claims. And certain Christian writers have been warning of widespread plagues and pestilence as far back as we can remember. But what is clear is what Jesus does say in that same chapter 24 of Matthew. Let's just read verse 36, chapter 24. It says, "No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." And then in verses 42 to 44, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." Jesus says we don't know the time, but he says be prepared. He says be ready. And the best way we can be ready is to continue to ask God to help us to follow the greatest commandment. And that is to love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the second commandment, that's like the first, is to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's what we got to be focusing on. Loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving, caring for our neighbor, for our loved one. And at that time, in the midst of that, being ready for Christ's return, though we don't know when that's going to be. So let's be faithful. Let's be obedient. Let's be caring. Let's be praying. Let's be looking to God. Because in this moment of uncertainty, we can rest and we can have the confidence of knowing that we are in the grip of God's grace. You see, God's grip on us is much firmer and greater than our grip on him. So friends, The Lord be with you today. May you be blessed. Take care.